The second week of our 3-week unit on film history deals with the classical Hollywood cinema era. This is the period from the beginning of sound cinema, which was complete in about 1930. The transition from silent movies to sound movies was complete by about 1930, and that marks the beginning of the classical Hollywood period of American film history. The classical Hollywood period lasted then until about the mid-1950s. It's not quite as distinct when it ended, but it certainly went into the first few years of the 1950s. A number of different things happened in that first half of the 1950s that sort of marked the end of the classical Hollywood period, one of which was competition from television, changes in the film industry, and the migration of a lot of population in American cities from the center of the city to the suburban areas. So by about the mid-1950s, the classical Hollywood period is thought to have been over. Now, this term classical is probably one that you have heard at different points before, especially in respect to classical music, but you may not have a real good understanding of what it means. So just briefly, the term classical, when it is applied to something like classical music or classical art, or in this case, classical Hollywood cinema, it refers to a system of art that had a distinct style, that had been refined and had been developed, and usually refers to a particular period as well. You know, classical Greece refers to a distinct period of ancient Greece, and classical Hollywood refers to this distinct period between 1930 and the early 1950s. One of the things that marks the classical Hollywood cinema is this distinct style that existed in the movies of this period. And this is sometimes referred to as classical narrative or classical film narrative. You'll hear this sort of terminology used often as well in describing the movies of this period of American film history. So for the movies of this period, for Hollywood movies of the classical era, this classical narrative was one in which there was very tightly plotted films, meaning that there wasn't very much found in these films in terms of scenes that took place or characters that were part of them that were not very closely related to whatever the plot was of the individual movie. These movies utilized a continuity style of filmmaking and editing, and they mainly stuck to genre storytelling. There were very few films in the classical Hollywood period that could not fit into one sort of film genre or another, which is less so the case today. In the classical Hollywood period, almost all movies could be fit into one particular genre or another in terms of the variety of different film genres. There's a few different things that characterize more succinctly the classical Hollywood period, and the first of these is a factory system of production by movie studios. Movie studios in this period of roughly the 1930s and 1940s had developed a system of production, over the course of the silent movie era. The movie studios had developed a system of production in which movies were made sort of in assembly line fashion. Each part of a movie was made by the the distinct department, and it sort of moved along the assembly line as the different parts of the movie were added to it in terms of pre-production and production and post-production phases, as we learned about those phases earlier in the semester. And you maybe have heard the term the movie factory. Well, that's where that term comes from, and the individual films that were created during the classical Hollywood era were treated very much like they were sort of interchangeable parts in terms of characters, in terms of plot elements, in terms of elements of mise-en-scène and cinematography. They were made in this assembly line fashion that for each individual studio gave them sort of a standardized look in many cases. Films of the classical Hollywood period also had a continuity editing style. We learned about continuity editing when we studied editing earlier in the semester. And we also learned about some other alternative forms of editing, especially that found in the Soviet silent cinema. But in the classical Hollywood narrative, or in films from the classical Hollywood period, this continuity editing style was the predominant use of film style in the films made during this period. There was, during the classical Hollywood era, what was called a production code, which means that there was a code of content that all of the movie studios subscribed to and agreed to follow in terms of what sorts of things could be portrayed in Hollywood movies when it came to violence, when it came to sex, when it came to profanity, and when it came to the representation of a whole lot of things like religion and crime and morality and so forth. And so the movie studios basically exercised self-censorship during these years in agreeing together, the studios as a group agreeing that they would not show explicit sex or explicit violence or profanity into their movies. And they did that through this series of guidelines or standards called the production code. Another thing that characterized the movies in the classical Hollywood period is the fact that many movies, many of the products, so to speak, that came off of the assembly lines of the factory system of movie production were what were called star genre combinations, or exhibited what were called star genre combinations. This is the phenomenon in which a particular genre of film was matched up with a particular star, and that star throughout their career appeared mainly in movies of that genre. And audiences came to expect that and, sort of identify particular stars with particular genres of film, which is done still sometimes today, but in the classical Hollywood era, it was done to a much greater degree, and most of the movie stars were restricted, for the most part, to a particular genre that they appeared in films from that genre. The last thing that characterized, in a broad sense, movies of the classical Hollywood period was this mystique that Hollywood movies had. Even today, Hollywood films and just the idea of Hollywood has this sort of mythology or mystique or glamour that attaches to them. And this was really played up and really emphasized during the classical Hollywood period of the 30s and 40s. The factory system was sometimes described as being a dream factory. And that was played up in the public relations and the publicity of Hollywood movies of that era, trying to make these films, in many respects, seem like they were very special and portrayed characters that were apart from ordinary life and had a sort of mystique and glamour to them in a way that most people, average audience members, did not experience in their own lives. So, going to go through each of these characteristics now in a little bit more detail, the list that I just completed. And the first of these is this studio system. You probably have heard by me throughout this semester, as well as prior to taking this class, this term, the studio system. Well, the studio system is basically the structure of the film industry that existed beginning in the silent era, the very end of the silent movie era, and to some extent still exists today. The same studios certainly still exist today with the same names, but it was in this period of the 1930s and 1940s that it sort of reached its height. As I said, this factory system of production had been established, where each studio had departments in each area of filmmaking. So every studio had a costume department, an editing department, a sound department, a writing department that had staffs of writers, and also a variety of lead actors, or the biggest movie stars, as well as a whole complement of supporting actors that were under contract, meaning that those movie stars and those actors worked exclusively for that particular studio and did not make movies for any other studio. And so this sort of assembly line way of making movies was established, and as a result, movies were able to be made relatively quickly and relatively efficiently using this factory system of production that prevailed beginning in the end of the silent era in the late teens and 1920s, and continuing through all of the studio era, all of the classical Hollywood era of the 30s and 40s, and into the 50s, and not really until probably about the beginning of the 1960s did the factory system really sort of disappear and break down. The continuity style was another broad characteristic of the classical Hollywood era. This, like the factory system of production, had also been established by the late silent era of the 1920s. And basically, the continuity style meant that all stylistic aspects of movies, the mise-en-scène, the editing, the sound, the cinematography, all of the different elements of style that we have learned about this semester were subordinated to the story, meaning that there was no camera moves used, there were no sound elements used, there were no particular edits that took place, and there were no elements of mise-en-scène in the variety that the elements of mise-en-scène are found that appeared in a movie unless it was somehow related to the story. And in fact, stylistic elements were secondary to the story that was being told. And many of these techniques of style, such as many of the stylistic devices involved in continuity editing, or what was called invisible editing, were developed specifically for the purposes of storytelling, to try and make storytelling more understandable and to try and make storytelling more easily done using the medium of film. And so as a result, the continuity style became a very powerful method of telling stories by using moving images in the classical Hollywood era. There's a reason why most of the films from this period still are very relatable to us today, and why many of them, in terms of their quality, still seem very strong and very well-made films to us today, is because of the uh, capacities of this continuity style that prevailed and really sort of ruled stylistically and in terms of storytelling during the classical Hollywood era of American cinema. This production code is one of the reasons why that continuity style was able to be so effective, was that the sorts of things that might create disruptions in movies in terms of controversial content were able to be kept under control, so to speak, through the use or the application of the production code. Continuity style, if that was a sort of a code for the use of style in movies, then during the classical Hollywood period, the production code was a code for the use of content. One of the reasons that the studios put into place the production code was that they wanted movies to have each movie to have the broadest possible appeal, meaning that any sorts of things that any viewers might object to, such as portrayals of sex or violence or crime, or particular ways in which religion was portrayed, or use of foul language or obscene language in movies, was eliminated completely. And all movies were made in such a way and had their content portrayed in such a way that any person, including down to the youngest child, would be able to watch any movie that was made by a Hollywood movie studio and would not have anything that offended their sensibilities or exposed young children to something in terms of sex or violence or language that they shouldn't be seeing. And this was a time before the rating system that we have now, the rating system that we still have today and that we're familiar with, sort of replaced the production code in the late 1960s. And that's one of the elements of the new Hollywood that we'll look at next week. But prior to the rating system, when before there were these ratings that differentiated content in movies, the production code ensured that all movies would be able to be viewable and not offend any of the youngest or most sensitive viewers. And this was able to be done because all of the major movie studios banded together and sort of joined together to dictate what could and could not be shown in movies. And because all of the studios that were producing movies were involved in this, they were able to sort of keep a good handle on the content that was allowed in movies. The next thing that was characteristic of classical Hollywood films was the star-genre combination. Classical Hollywood movies often took the form of combinations of stars and genres. As I already said, a particular star would be paired with a particular genre of movie, and that genre would become their trademark, so to speak. Particular stars and particular movie genres would be identified with one another, and most of the movies that that particular movie star made would be from that genre. And this allowed a number of things in terms of the way in which movies were made and presented to audiences during the classical Hollywood era. It meant that every time that a new movie came out with that particular star in it, audiences knew what to expect. Audience expectations were able to be managed via these combinations of stars and film genres. And as a result, movie theaters were able to have very predictable box office business for particular movies because of the popularity of the star genre combinations that existed. So a few of these star genre combinations, some of which you may have heard of before or be familiar with some of these figures. For instance, John Wayne Westerns. Uh, the Western genre and John Wayne as a movie star became very closely identified with one another during the classical Hollywood period. You know, John Wayne, the type of character, the type of cowboy that he played in Western movies has sort of become to us now sort of the iconic movie cowboy. And that was because of the use of star genre combination, in which John Wayne starred mostly in Western movies, and many of the most popular Western films starred John Wayne. Now, certainly not all Westerns had John Wayne in them. Many Westerns were made, and of course, John Wayne couldn't star in all of them. But he did become very closely identified with the Western film as a genre. And John Wayne did not appear exclusively in Western films. He appeared in uh, other genres of movies besides just Westerns, but certainly Westerns were uh, the majority of the films that he appeared in. And one of the things that studios were able to do with movies that John Wayne were in that were not Westerns was to sort of play that up as well. You know, John Wayne in a different kind of movie was able to be part of the marketing and the promotion for those movies. Another star genre combination that was a very successful one during the classical Hollywood period was Greta Garbo costume dramas. Greta Garbo was an actress who was Swedish in origin. She's from Sweden and became a movie star in the silent era of the 1920s. And before sound cinema even came in, she had become identified with a particular kind of costume drama in which she played historical figures, sometimes queens, and wore elaborate costumes. Such as you see in this image, befitting the particular historical period in which, or historical culture in which the particular narrative or plot of that movie took place in. Astaire Rogers musicals is another example of a star genre combination. Fred Astaire in this image on the right, and Ginger Rogers on the left, paired up in quite a few movies over the course of the 1930s and 1940s. And they were both accomplished dancers and had a number of relatively complex and sophisticated musical dance numbers that appeared in their films, as well as musical numbers in which they sang, one or both of them. And so they, as a pair of performers, uh, became identified and connected with musicals as a genre. Finally, James Cagney gangster films is one last example of a star genre combinations. James Cagney, sometimes called Jimmy Cagney, became a big star in films of the gangster genre during the 1930s and 1940s. And so he appeared as a gangster character in a great many of these movies, sort of as a tough guy sort of figure. And many of the most successful gangster films of the classical Hollywood period had Jimmy Cagney or James Cagney as their star. And so finally, that brings us back around to this idea of the dream factory. Movie studios were often described during the classical Hollywood period as dream factories. And the combination of all of the things that I've been talking about in this lecture, the method of production in terms of factory system of production, continuity style, the content that was regulated by the production code, and the different combinations of stars and genres in Hollywood, movies made Hollywood movies as a general category internationally popular, and one of the things that movies were seen to do in this period was to sort of sell dreams of various kinds, aspirations of people, portray a kind of life that was apart from that audiences typically experienced during these decades of the 1930s and 1940s, which, as you probably are aware from your knowledge of general American history, were marked in the 1930s by the Great Depression, a period of great poverty and economic challenge, and in the 1940s, the first half of the 1940s, by World War II and everything that came with fighting in that war. And so Hollywood movies of this period sort of tried to portray a dream-like life and gained a mystique and a mythos that persists to this day in terms of the sorts of things that classical Hollywood cinema represents and the sorts of things that were found then and still today in movies made during the classical Hollywood era.